In the dim light of a silent apartment, Grace clenched the crumpled note summoning her to a job interview. Her trembling fingers betrayed the weight of a past that still haunted her present. Condemned for a mistake that replayed endlessly in her sleepless nights, she was about to cross a new threshold, being interviewed to care for Samuel Rochester, a reclusive millionaire left paralyzed after his wife had mysteriously vanished months earlier. Fear and hope waged war within her as the deep chime of a wall clock echoed, marking the beginning of something inevitable. Grace stared at the slip of paper in her hands as if it were both a key and a trap. The simple, worn page bore only a few stark words: job interview, Rochester Manor, 2 p.m. It was her first opportunity since leaving prison, yet it felt more like an invitation to be judged all over again. That morning, she'd woken early, not out of nervousness but habit. Discomfort had become her constant companion. The tiny one-room flat she called home was stifling and damp, its walls carrying the musty smell of old paint. Bills had piled up on the counter, sitting next to a chipped mug she used for her watery coffee. Every detail was a harsh reminder of how far she was from anything resembling a normal life. After slipping on her best outfit, a plain black suit that now hung loose after months of poor nutrition, Grace sat before a cracked mirror. With unsteady hands, she applied lipstick, attempting to mask the exhaustion etched in her eyes. But deep down, she knew it wasn't just her appearance that needed fixing. Her very soul felt threadbare. Outside, as she waited for the bus, she felt the familiar sting of stares. A neighbor eyed her for too long, as if aware of her past. Another muttered something to the woman beside him, and they both snickered. Grace turned her gaze away, but the sensation of being constantly watched was inescapable. Since her release, this had become her reality: whispers, stolen glances, and metaphorical doors slammed shut before she could even knock. During the bus ride, her thoughts drifted to the years spent behind bars. The clanging of metal doors, the cold walls, the unyielding rules. The sound of those gates slamming shut still echoed in her dreams. She often thought about the life she'd had before that fatal mistake, a moment of desperation that had led to a crime she'd never envisioned committing. To most people, once they learned her story, she was nothing more than a labeled criminal star. It was as though Grace had ceased to exist as a person. When she stepped off the bus, Rochester Manor loomed like something from another world. The iron gates gleamed under the sun, and the paved path leading to the entrance was flanked by towering trees that seemed to scrape the sky. Grace felt small and out of place, like an intruder. As she crossed through the gates, her heartbeat thundered in her chest. She paused to steady herself, clutching the invitation with one hand while the other reached into her coat pocket to touch the small crucifix she kept there. It had been a gift from her mother years ago, a reminder of the little good still left in her life. When she pressed the doorbell, it dawned on her that this was more than just a job interview. It was a test of who she had become, or who she was trying to be. This was her chance to prove, perhaps more to herself than to anyone else, that she was worth something despite everything. The door creaked open to reveal Martha, the housekeeper, who eyed Grace up and down with a neutral yet scrutinizing expression. "You must be Grace," she said flatly. "Come in. Mr. Rochester is expecting you." Grace stepped inside, adjusting her coat as the knot in her stomach tightened. The manor's interior was even more imposing than the outside. Every surface gleamed, filled with antique furniture and artwork that radiated wealth almost to the point of suffocation. Yet, beneath the grandeur, there was a stark coldness, a heavy silence that screamed that something was amiss. As Martha led her through the corridors, Grace's mind raced, searching for the right words to convince a millionaire to trust her, an ex-convict, with his life and home. Her palms grew clammy, and she forced herself to take deep breaths to steady her nerves. With every step, doubts crept in. What if he knows? What if he doesn't believe me? What if no one ever believes me again? But as daunting as this interview felt, Grace knew there was no going back. The alternative was worse: more closed doors, more sleepless nights wondering if she'd ever get another chance. Upon reaching the door to Samuel Rochester's study, Grace offered a final silent prayer and crossed the threshold. The study was spacious but far from welcoming. Tall windows allowed enough light to filter in, but the heavy curtains cast shadows that danced across the dark wood-paneled walls. At the center of the room sat a large, imposing desk, meticulously arranged with neatly stacked papers. Behind it, there he was. Samuel, seated in his wheelchair, looked every bit like a king on his throne despite his immobility. His dark eyes were sharp, cold, and penetrating, scrutinizing Grace as if he could see through her skin and into the depths of her soul. He didn't speak immediately, and the silence that hung between them was so thick that Grace could almost hear it hum. "Your Grace," his voice was steady, almost challenging. He didn't need to add the ex-convict asterisk. It was implied in the tone, in the faint arch of his brow, a silent reminder. "Yes, sir," Grace replied, her voice steady despite the frantic rhythm of her heart. "They told me you were available. Why would someone like you want to care for someone like me?" The question was simple but heavy with unspoken meaning. Grace knew he wasn't merely asking about the job. He wanted to know why she, a woman with a tarnished past, thought she could fill such a role. She swallowed hard but refused to shrink away. Instead, she took a deep breath and chose honesty. "Because I know what it's like to be overlooked, Mr. Rochester. I know what it feels like to be seen as less than human. And because," her voice wavered, her throat tightening, "because I need a chance. And if you give me this chance, I promise you won't regret it." Samuel held her gaze for a few agonizing seconds, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched once more, oppressive and loaded, until he finally leaned forward, bracing himself with his hands on the desk. "Martha's explained that this won't be easy?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Start tomorrow." The words came so abruptly that Grace barely registered them. She blinked, momentarily stunned, expecting him to follow up with some cautionary advice or, perhaps, a shred of encouragement. But all she received was a signal from Martha, indicating it was time to leave. On her way out, relief and suspicion warred within her. This was progress, yes, but why had he agreed so quickly? What had motivated him to hire an ex-convict for such a personal role? Still, Grace knew better than to question her fortune too deeply. This opportunity, heavy as it was the only one she had. The next morning, she returned to Rochester Manor, braced for her first day on the job. From the outset, the tension was palpable. Martha wasted no time in establishing her expectations. "If you think he was difficult in the interview," the housekeeper remarked as she guided Grace through the labyrinthine corridors, "just wait until you see him day to day." Grace was introduced to an exhaustive list of tasks. Caring for Samuel wasn't just about meeting his physical needs, it also meant dealing with a man seemingly intent on keeping everyone at arm's length. For the first few days, Samuel barely spoke to her, issuing only clipped, frosty commands. He avoided eye contact, as if deliberately making it clear that trust was far from earned. Grace, for her part, couldn't blame him. The work was grueling, both physically and emotionally. Lifting Samuel from his bed to his wheelchair required strength and precision, but the true challenge was enduring the silence, a silence heavy with unsaid words and emotions Samuel refused to reveal. Grace, meanwhile, felt a constant pressure to prove herself, though she had no idea how to breach the invisible wall he'd built around himself. One evening, as she tidied Samuel's room, Grace noticed a photograph on the bedside table. It depicted Samuel and a dark-haired woman with a radiant smile, taken clearly before his current condition. The expression on Samuel's face in the picture was unrecognizable, lighter, more alive. For a moment, Grace couldn't help but wonder what else he had lost beyond his mobility. As she picked up the photograph for a closer look, a voice cut through the air like a whip. "Don't touch that." Grace jumped, caught off guard. Turning, she saw Samuel at the doorway, his expression as hard as stone. "I'm sorry, I was just..." "I told you not to touch it," he repeated, his voice deep and measured, though there was a flicker of pain he couldn't entirely hide. Grace carefully placed the photo back where she found it, the weight of her mistake pressing down on her. "Who is she?" she ventured quietly. Samuel remained silent for a long moment before answering, his voice barely above a whisper. "My wife." Grace didn't know what to say. Pieces of Samuel's story began falling into place in her mind, the grief, the anger, the isolation. She could sense there was more to it, something he wasn't ready to share. Even so, it was in that moment that Grace resolved not just to do the job, but to do everything she could to give him back something he seemed to have lost, even if it was just a sliver of hope. The following morning, Grace's alarm blared at 5:30 a.m. She stretched slowly, her joints protesting after the day before. The thin mattress of her sofa bed offered little relief, but it was the strain of her work at the manor that truly left her aching. Still, there was something strangely comforting about being tired for the right reasons. It was different from prison, where the days dragged on, hollow and endless. She put a kettle on to boil while spooning instant coffee into a chipped mug. The smell wasn't exactly pleasant, but the warmth of the drink was enough. Outside, the hum of traffic and the occasional honk of a car horn echoed through the neighborhood. Grace glanced at the clock and realized she needed to hurry. She grabbed her warm coat and battered bag before stepping out into the chill. While she waited for the bus, her thoughts drifted to the past. The morning light cast soft shadows on the buildings around her, but her mind was filled with darker places, steel bars, cold walls, and judgmental stares. It was strange to think how drastically her life had changed. A few years ago, she'd been a waitress at a small diner on the outskirts of town. The days were long, but she'd liked the work. It was honest, and she took pride in earning her keep, even if it wasn't much. But everything fell apart the night her younger, reckless brother showed up at her door asking for help. Liam had always been the type to attract trouble. He had a heart too big for his own good and a knack for getting involved with the wrong people. That night, he was in deep, owing money to some dangerous types. Grace had tried to help him, but things quickly spiraled out of control. There was shouting, a scuffle, and in the heat of the moment, one push led to something irreversible. The gang leader fell, hit his head, and died instantly. When the police sirens wailed in the distance, there wasn't much left to explain. In a desperate bid to protect Liam, Grace took the blame. It was an accident, she'd told the police over and over, but it didn't seem to matter. She was convicted of manslaughter, and Liam vanished, a brother who never looked back. Now, every step Grace took towards the gates of Rochester Manor felt weighted with those choices. She didn't regret trying to protect Liam, but she often wondered if he thought of her. If he knew what she'd sacrificed for him. At the gate, she greeted the security guard with a nod. He returned her gesture with a frosty look, but she'd stopped expecting anything more. She was used to the distance people kept from her ever since her record became public knowledge. The path to the entrance was always the same, lined with towering trees and pristine gardens that stood in stark contrast to the chaos in her mind. Deep down, Grace knew it wasn't just the interview that had shifted her routine, it was the manor itself, with its air of mystery and tension, silently questioning whether she truly belonged there. Inside, Martha was already waiting in the foyer, as usual. "He's in a foul mood today," the housekeeper warned bluntly. Grace simply nodded, taking a steadying breath. Samuel's bad moods were a constant she was learning to navigate. But that day, as she made her way to Samuel's room, the weight of her past still clung to her. The creak of the floorboards underfoot seemed to echo in sync with the doubt circling her mind. There were days she wondered if she'd ever shake off the label of ex-convict. More importantly, she wondered if she could ever forgive herself for what happened on that fateful night. When she opened the door, Grace found Samuel in his wheelchair, staring out of the window. He didn't turn to look at her, but spoke bluntly, "You're late." Grace checked the clock. She was, in fact, 2 minutes past the hour. "I apologize, Mr. Rochester," she replied calmly. She knew there was no point arguing. He was only testing her boundaries. As she began the day's tasks, helping him dress and organizing his medication, Samuel broke the silence with an unexpected question. "Why were you in prison?" Grace froze, a chill running down her spine. She had known this moment would come, just not so soon. She met his gaze for a moment, debating how much to reveal. "It was an accident," she said, keeping her voice even. "I was trying to help someone I loved, but things got out of hand. And the consequences were worse than I ever expected." Samuel studied her, his eyes sharp with curiosity, but he didn't press her for more. Instead, he did something Grace hadn't anticipated. He gave a slight nod, as though he accepted her answer, at least for now. That moment felt like the start of something Grace couldn't quite define. Perhaps it was the beginning of a silent truce between two broken people, both bearing the weight of pasts that refused to let them go. Grace's days at Rochester Manor were intense and exhausting. From the moment she passed through the gates until the end of her shift, she barely had time to catch her breath. Her routine began early, preparing Samuel's medications, tidying his room, helping him get dressed, and ensuring he was comfortable in his wheelchair before breakfast. But comfortable was a tricky concept with Samuel. He was rarely satisfied. The pillows were too high, the bath water wasn't the perfect temperature, or the morning paper didn't arrive exactly when he wanted it. Grace quickly learned that working for him was a test of patience. One morning, as she adjusted his position in the wheelchair, he grumbled, "If you can't handle something this simple, how do you expect to last here?" Grace felt frustration bubbling up, but she bit her tongue. It was as if he was searching for a reason to push her away, just as he seemed to do with everyone else. Instead of snapping back, she took a deep breath and replied calmly, "I'll try again, Mr. Rochester." Samuel studied her for a few seconds, as if trying to read her thoughts, then turned his gaze away. This was his way. He tested, he provoked, but he never truly crossed the line. At the end of the day, Grace returned to her small apartment utterly drained. Her hands ached from maneuvering Samuel's wheelchair and handling his medical equipment, and her mind was worn thin from the strained interactions with him and Martha, who always seemed to be watching for mistakes. Yet, something deeper gnawed at her. As she made herself a simple cup of tea for dinner, her thoughts kept circling back to the fragmented conversations she'd had with Samuel. She was beginning to realize that he, too, carried a pain that wasn't immediately visible. The disappearance of his wife, combined with the loss of his mobility, had left him a bitter, isolated, and mistrustful man. Although Samuel rarely spoke about himself, Grace had started piecing together parts of his past through observations and offhand remarks. He was a man who once seemed to have everything: wealth, influence, and a promising career before the accident. But the disappearance of his wife, something the tabloid press had milked relentlessly, had shattered him. Worse still, many speculated that he was involved in her disappearance, rumors that Grace sensed still haunted him. One day, as Grace adjusted the cushions on his chair, Samuel broke the silence with a question that caught her off guard. Do you think people can change? The question made Grace pause. She took a moment to gather her thoughts before replying carefully. I think they can. But it's not easy. And not everyone believes you've changed, even when you try. Samuel turned his gaze to the window, his expression distant. He seemed to be mulling over something. People see me a certain way, he began, and no matter what I do, it's impossible to change that. Grace wanted to ask more, to delve deeper, but she knew he wasn't ready for that kind of conversation. Still, those words lingered with her for the rest of the day. It was as if, in his own guarded way, he was sharing a small piece of his pain with her, though only in measured doses. Working at the manor wasn't just physically demanding, it was emotionally draining too. Grace had to remain constantly vigilant, as even the smallest mistake could unleash Samuel's temper or Martha's sharp judgment. One day, while organizing Samuel's medications, she accidentally dropped a bottle, scattering pills across the floor. Martha appeared almost instantly, as though she could smell the error. Do you think being new here gives you the right to be careless? Martha asked, folding her arms. If something happens to Mr. Rochester, it will be on your head. Grace quickly crouched down, gathering the pills, her face burning with embarrassment. She knew she couldn't afford to make too many mistakes. There was likely a queue of people waiting to replace her, and the fact that she'd landed this job at all already felt like a victory she couldn't risk losing. Even so, Grace began to find brief moments of connection with Samuel. One afternoon, as she adjusted the table for him to work on his papers, she commented, "The house is so quiet. Don't you miss having more people around?" Samuel let out a bitter laugh. More people mean more questions, more stares. I prefer the solitude. But solitude weighs on you, Grace replied without thinking. Samuel turned to look at her, surprised by her boldness, but said nothing. As the weeks passed, Grace began noticing small changes in Samuel. He was still abrasive, but every now and then, he would watch her with a curious expression, as if trying to figure out why she stayed despite his constant resistance. Meanwhile, Grace felt that the manor was slowly shaping her. She became more resilient, learning to face the daily challenges and handle the judgments from both Samuel and Martha. One day, after completing an especially demanding task, Samuel said something she hadn't expected: "You're persistent." "That's rare." Grace looked at him, caught off guard. It wasn't exactly a warm compliment, but coming from Samuel, it was the closest thing to one she'd heard. "Persistence is all I've got," she replied with a small smile. It was in moments like these that Grace began to feel that, despite the crushing routine and constant tension, something was being built between them. Something she couldn't quite name, but that kept her going. The announcement of the event came without warning. Martha informed Grace early in the morning as she prepared Samuel's coffee. "Mr. Rochester will be attending a charity gala at the business club tonight. He needs to be ready by 7. Grace blinked, confused. "An event? He's going out?" "It's rare," Martha replied in her usual frosty tone, "but it happens. Just do your job and make sure he's presentable. These events are important." Grace nodded, but a knot formed in her stomach. Samuel rarely left the house, and she knew something so public would leave him feeling exposed. For her, it was just another layer of stress to navigate. They spent the entire afternoon preparing. Grace carefully selected Samuel's suit, making sure every detail was perfect. It was the first time she'd seen him in anything other than pajamas or casual clothes. The tailored black suit and understated tie gave him an air of authority once more, but seated in his wheelchair, Samuel looked uncomfortable. "It's not perfect, but it'll have to do," he remarked, glancing at himself in the mirror with a bored expression. Grace, accustomed to his criticism by now, remained patient. "You look fine. Smart, even." He cast her a sidelong glance. That's what people say when they can't think of anything better to say. Before they left, Grace took a moment to fix her own hair and slipped on a simple blue dress she picked up from a second-hand shop. It wasn't particularly elegant, but it was the best she could afford. When the two of them were ready, they climbed into the car that would take them to the event. Samuel remained silent throughout the journey, staring out of the window. Grace could feel the tension in the air, but she wasn't sure if it was her own anxiety or Samuel's that made the atmosphere so heavy. The business club's ballroom was dazzling, adorned with crystal chandeliers and tables elegantly set with fine china and silverware. Wealthy, impeccably dressed guests glided through the space, glasses of champagne in hand, their voices low but just loud enough to ensure they were noticed. As soon as they entered, all eyes turned to Samuel. Grace noticed the whispers and the stares, filled with a mix of pity and curiosity. She knew many people there were familiar with his story, the accident that had left him paralyzed and the mysterious disappearance of his wife. He was both a tragic figure and an enigma. Samuel ignored it all, or at least he pretended to. Grace, however, felt the weight of those looks and stayed close, acting as a quiet support. As they moved through the room, a middle-aged man with an artificial smile approached them. "Samuel, what a surprise to see you here. And who's this young lady?" He gave Grace a once-over, his assessment all too obvious. "My carer," Samuel said curtly, offering no further explanation. The man raised an eyebrow, his smile turning sly. "Interesting. Not often you bring company." Grace tried to smile politely, but the remark only made her feel more out of place. Moments later, Samuel requested a glass of water. Grace went over to the drinks table and carefully balanced a tray with the water and a small plate of canapes he'd mentioned wanting. But as she returned, her foot caught on the edge of the luxurious rug, and she stumbled. The tray went flying, and the glass of water landed squarely on the dress of a nearby woman, a socialite whose pleasant expression immediately twisted into outrage. "Oh, for heaven's sake," the woman shrieked, stepping back as if she'd been assaulted. "Who let her in here?" Grace's face burned as she scrambled to apologize. "I'm so sorry. It was an accident." The woman was having none of it. "Do you think you can just waltz into a place like this and make a fool of yourself? Who even brought you?" Before Grace could respond, Samuel rolled his chair forward, his face a mix of irritation and what seemed like genuine anger. "She's with me," he said firmly. "And I suggest you show a bit of civility, something money clearly can't buy." The woman opened her mouth to argue but hesitated. Around them, murmurs began to ripple through the crowd. Samuel added, "Now, if you'll excuse us, my carer and I have more important things to attend to than dealing with spoiled children." Grace felt a brief wave of relief but knew this wasn't the end of it. As Samuel maneuvered his chair to leave the scene, someone muttered loud enough for everyone to hear, "Should have known ex-cons don't belong at events like this." The words cut through Grace like a knife. She saw Samuel pause for a moment, turning slightly towards the source of the comment. He didn't say anything, but his expression darkened. "Let's go," he said quietly, his voice controlled but laced with tension. The silence in the car on the way back was stifling. Grace couldn't hold back the tears that had been building up since the incident. "I ruined everything," she said, her voice shaking. "I shouldn't have come." Samuel glanced at her, and for the first time, his expression softened. "You didn't ruin anything," he said, surprising her. "If anyone came off worse tonight, it was that lot of idiots." Grace wiped her eyes, but the words she'd heard earlier still echoed in her mind. "They know about me. About my record. That's why I'll never be anything more than that, an ex-con." Samuel hesitated before replying. "Do you think I'm just the man in a wheelchair? The one everyone looks at with either pity or disgust?" He paused. "Because that's how they see me. But it's not who I am." Grace turned to him, realizing that, in some way, he understood exactly how she felt. "I went to prison because of a mistake," she began, her voice tentative. "Something I did to protect my brother, but it cost me everything." She swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her confession. "I'll never get back to who I was before." Samuel studied her for a moment before responding. "I've lost everything too. My career, my independence, my wife. And you know what I've learned? You don't need to go back to who you were. You just need to figure out how to be who you are now." Samuel's words lingered in the air. For the first time, Grace felt that he truly saw her, not just as his carer or a woman burdened by her past, but as a person in her own right. In that moment, amidst the failure of the event and the sting of humiliation, something began to shift between them. In the days following the event, the dynamic between Grace and Samuel subtly changed. While he remained sharp-tongued and quick with his sarcastic remarks, there was a faint softness in their exchanges. Grace, in turn, started to see through his bitter exterior, glimpsing a deeply wounded man who, despite his efforts to conceal it, still cared. The mornings were as busy as ever, but the once oppressive silence in their routine was broken by occasional conversations. As Grace helped Samuel prepare for the day, he began to share snippets of his life, moments that seemed more an attempt to fill the quiet than a true desire to open up. One afternoon, as Grace adjusted the cushions on Samuel's chair, he began speaking without warning. "I used to be a very different man," he said, his gaze fixed on the window. "Ambitious, ruthless, maybe even a bit arrogant. My company was my life. Everything I did was to climb higher, faster." Grace paused, caught off guard by his willingness to share something so personal. Samuel rarely spoke about his past, and when he did, it was usually with defensiveness or dismissiveness. "And then the accident happened," he continued, his voice quieter now. "In seconds, I lost my mobility. And with that, I realized just how fragile my life really was. My wife, Anna, stayed by my side at first. But then, she disappeared." Grace frowned. She'd heard rumors about Anna's disappearance but had never known the details. "Everyone thinks I did something to her," Samuel said, his voice trembling slightly. "The police investigated, the media had their field day with the theories. But the truth is, I don't know what happened. One day she was here. The next, she was gone." Grace felt a lump in her throat. There was a raw pain in his words, something he rarely allowed to surface. "Do you still think about her?" she asked gently. "Every day," he replied. "She was the only one who saw me for who I was, not for what I had. Losing that, It was like losing everything all over again. Grace nodded, a different kind of heaviness settling over her. She understood what it felt like to lose everything, even if their losses were different, the emptiness was the same. That evening, as Grace tidied Samuel's room, she decided to share more of her own story. "My brother was the only family I had," she began quietly. Samuel glanced up at her, listening intently. "He got into trouble with the wrong people. And that night, when everything went wrong, I took the blame for him. I thought I was protecting him. I thought I was doing the right thing." She paused, the weight of her words catching in her throat. Samuel didn't respond immediately, but his gaze wasn't cold or judgmental anymore. "And him? What happened to him?" Grace shrugged, a sad smile forming on her lips. "I never saw him again. He left, and I stayed to face the consequences. I spent 2 years in prison, treated like a criminal. And now, that's all I am to the world, an ex-con." Samuel shook his head, his expression hardening. "The world loves to slap labels on people. Believe me, I know that all too well. But you don't have to accept them." Grace stayed silent, but his words stuck with her. For the first time, someone didn't see her as just her mistakes. The days that followed were just as busy as before, but something had shifted between Grace and Samuel. Small gestures began to creep into their daily interactions, Samuel allowing Grace to help him with less resistance, and Grace finding little ways to make his routine more bearable. One afternoon, as Grace reorganized Samuel's medication, he said something unexpected. "You're improving." She glanced at him, surprised. "At sorting pills?" "At everything," he replied. Then, almost as if to deflect the moment, he added, "But don't let it go to your head." Grace smiled for the first time in days, a genuine smile she hadn't realized she was still capable of. A week later, Samuel surprised her again. "I need to go out," he announced as she helped him get dressed. "Going out? Where to?" "I need to visit my wife's solicitor," Samuel said. "There's something I've been putting off for far too long." Grace hesitated but understood this was important. She helped him prepare, this time with extra care. In the car, the silence between them felt different, not awkward, but heavy with meaning. When they arrived at the solicitor's office, Grace stayed in the reception area while Samuel went in alone. Although she couldn't hear the conversation, she could tell it mattered to him. Perhaps he was ready to face the past, or at least to search for answers he didn't have. When he returned, his expression was unreadable. On the way back, he finally broke the silence. "Thank you for not asking." Grace nodded. "I figured you'd tell me when you're ready." Samuel glanced at her for a moment before looking away. "Maybe one day." That night, as Grace helped Samuel settle in for bed, she sensed something had shifted between them. There was a newfound respect, a quiet connection between two people the world had cast aside but who were, somehow, finding strength in one another. "Good night, Mr. Rochester," Grace said as she switched off the light. "Good night, Grace," he replied, his tone softer than she'd ever heard before. In that moment, she realized that, despite everything, something new had entered her life, a sense of possibility. As the weeks passed, Grace and Samuel's routine began to change. The silences, once thick with tension, were now filled with spontaneous conversations and occasional laughter. There was a new dynamic between them, something closer to a partnership. It was clear that both carried deep scars, but somehow, they were learning to live with them together. One afternoon, as Grace pushed Samuel's wheelchair through the manor's garden, an activity he had initially loathed but now tolerated without complaint, they came across a blooming rose bush. Samuel stopped and pointed at the flowers. "Anna loved roses," he said, his voice softer than usual. Grace paused, leaning slightly to admire the flowers. "Do you still think about her every day?" Samuel nodded. "It's impossible not to. She was the one who made me want to be better. And now, sometimes I wonder if the world would have been easier for her without me." Grace sat on a nearby bench, folding her hands in her lap. "I think about that too. That maybe it would have been easier for my family if I'd never come back. When I got out of prison, no one was there. They decided it was better to keep their distance." Samuel turned to her, studying her face. "It's not easy, carrying the weight of something you can't undo. But that doesn't mean you should give up. You're here now, aren't you?" Grace looked at him and smiled faintly. "And so are you." It was a simple moment, but it carried a profound meaning. For the first time, they both began to realize that, even broken, they could find strength in each other. One evening, after a particularly long and challenging day, Samuel asked Grace to stay a bit longer. She agreed without hesitation, sitting in an armchair in the corner of his room while he gazed out the window. "Grace," he began, his voice low, "do you think we deserve a second chance?" "Truly?" Grace took her time to answer. She thought about all the days she'd spent trying to prove she could change, even when the world insisted on seeing her only through the lens of her past. She thought about how exhausting it was to live in a constant state of redemption for people who might never believe in her. "I think we do," she said at last. "But I don't think a second chance is something people give to you. It's something you give yourself." Samuel turned to her, surprised by the depth of her words. He pondered for a moment before speaking. "I always thought my life ended the day of the accident. I lost my body, my wife, my purpose. But you're still here, even after everything you've been through. How do you keep going?" Grace gave him a bittersweet smile. "Because giving up doesn't change anything. It only makes things emptier." Samuel watched her, and for the first time, Grace saw something akin to admiration in his eyes. Over time, the two began to find small moments of normality amidst their demanding routine. Grace still worked tirelessly, caring for Samuel and navigating Martha's constant expectations, but now there was a lightness to certain parts of the day. Samuel, in turn, started to see Grace not just as his carer, but as someone he could speak to without pretense. At times, she challenged him with candid opinions he didn't expect, and other times, he surprised her with sarcastic comments that made her laugh despite herself. One day, as Grace tried to teach him how to use a tablet he'd recently bought, she ended up fumbling with the settings. Samuel laughed for the first time in weeks. "And you say I'm the stubborn one," he teased. "Laugh all you want, but just wait for next week's tech lesson," Grace replied with a grin. Their bond deepened unexpectedly when Grace was forced to confront her past. One afternoon, while running errands for the manor, she ran into someone she hadn't expected to see again, a former cellmate. The woman, with a challenging look, recognized her instantly. "Grace," she called out, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Didn't think I'd see you working for the rich and fancy. Bet they don't know who you really are, do they?" Grace froze, shame and fear washing over her. Before she could respond, Samuel, who had insisted on accompanying her that day, stepped forward. "She's my employee and my friend," he said firmly. "And whatever she's done in the past is none of your business or anyone else's." The woman shrugged, muttering something under her breath as she walked away. Grace turned to Samuel, stunned. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Yes, I did," he replied. "Because you shouldn't have to carry that burden alone." In that moment, Grace realized that Samuel didn't see her as just his carer. He respected her, and, in a way, he trusted her in a way few people ever had. Over time, the two fell into an unspoken ritual. Each evening, after her shift ended, Grace would sit in Samuel's room for a few minutes. Sometimes they'd talk about trivial things, the news, the weather, or something amusing Martha had said. Other times, their conversations turned deeper, regrets, hopes, and thoughts about the future. "Have you ever thought about doing something else?" Samuel asked one night. Grace shrugged. "I never thought I'd get a second chance. Now that I'm here, maybe, one day." Samuel offered a faint smile. "Maybe one day, then." Though the world still saw them as two broken people, Grace and Samuel were building something larger than their scars. They were piecing themselves back together, patiently, honestly, and with mutual respect. For the first time in a long while, they both felt there was a future worth fighting for. Their growing bond began to influence not only their interactions but also how they viewed their own lives. Small gestures came to define the friendship they were building. Grace learned Samuel's routines and preferences without needing to be told, and Samuel, little by little, made room for her in his tightly closed world. That didn't mean the challenges disappeared. Grace still dealt with the physical and emotional demands of her work, and Samuel, while more open, still had bouts of melancholy and irritation. But now, those moments were punctuated by something new, empathy. They both understood that their journeys were now entwined, each drawing strength from the other. One morning, as Grace helped Samuel sort through a stack of old documents, he pulled out a letter tucked between the pages of a book. The paper was yellowed with age, and his name was written on it in Anna's elegant handwriting. Samuel took the letter with trembling hands, hesitating before opening it. Grace, sensing the weight of the moment, stayed silent. "This letter," he began, staring at the paper as though it were a ghost. "She wrote this before she disappeared. I never had the courage to read it." Grace sat beside him, her gaze full of understanding. "Maybe it's time, Mr. Rochester." He looked at her, seeming to wrestle with himself. Then, with a heavy sigh, he unfolded the letter and began to read aloud. Samuel. I know you feel like the weight of the world is on your shoulders. You always have, ever since the day we met. But I want you to know you don't have to carry it all alone. You are more than your ambition, more than your successes. You are a man I love deeply, but a man who sometimes forgets to love himself. Samuel's voice faltered, and he lowered the letter. Grace didn't speak, but she placed a gentle hand on his arm, a quiet gesture of support. "She was right," he said at last, his voice low. "I always thought I needed to be invincible, to prove something to the world. But in the end, I lost what really mattered." Grace shook her head, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I think we all have things we wish we'd done differently. But maybe you haven't lost everything." Samuel looked at her, and in that moment, there was a connection that went beyond words. It was as if both understood they were learning, day by day, to live with the shadows of their pasts without letting them define who they were. A few days later, Samuel surprised Grace with a request. "I want to go out," he said during breakfast. Grace raised her eyebrows. "Go out? Where to?" "To town," he replied with a determined tone. "I haven't walked the streets, seen people, been part of the world in years. I think it's time. Grace was taken aback but agreed. She knew it would be challenging for him, and in some ways for herself too, but she also recognized it as an important step. That afternoon, the two left the manor together for the first time, not for an event or a formal obligation, but simply to explore the busy streets of the city. At first, Samuel seemed uneasy. The stares were inevitable, some curious, others pitying. Grace could feel the tension in his shoulders but decided to distract him with light-hearted conversation. "See that cafe over there," she said, pointing to a small bakery on the corner. "I worked there for 2 months before everything happened." Samuel glanced at the cafe and then at Grace. "And did you enjoy it?" "I loved the smell of fresh bread," she said with a nostalgic smile. "But I never had time to sit down and actually have a proper coffee. I was always too busy trying to pay the bills." He thought for a moment before saying, "Then let's have a coffee." At the cafe, sitting side by side, Samuel and Grace shared more stories from their lives. She told him about her childhood, the brother she still loved despite everything, and the dreams she'd had before life took her down a different path. Samuel, in turn, spoke of how he'd always been so focused on work that he forgot to enjoy life's simple pleasures, something Anna had tried to teach him, but that he was only now beginning to understand. "Do you think it's too late to start over?" he asked, staring into his coffee cup. Grace smiled. "I don't think it's ever too late. It might take more time and effort, but it's not impossible." Samuel tilted his head slightly, as though considering her words. For the first time, he seemed to truly believe there could be something beyond the manor, beyond his past. In the weeks that followed, Samuel began venturing out more often, always with Grace by his side. Together, they went to the market, the park, and even a bookshop he used to frequent before the accident. With each outing, he seemed more comfortable, more willing to face the world's stares and judgments. And Grace? She began to change too. Inspired by Samuel's determination, she enrolled in an evening course to complete her education, something she had always wanted to do but had never believed she could. When she told Samuel about the course, his reaction surprised her. "You should have told me sooner," he said. "I would have supported you from the start. I want to take this moment to acknowledge someone who, through their determination and kindness, has changed my life," he began, looking directly at Grace. "You reminded me that no matter how broken we think we are, there's always a chance to rebuild. Thank you, Grace." Grace, overwhelmed with emotion, tried to hold back her tears. It was the kind of recognition she had never expected, proof that her efforts had not been in vain. After dinner, Samuel and Grace sat together on the veranda of the manor. The night was cold, but the starry sky brought a sense of peace. "So, what's next for you?" Samuel asked, his curiosity genuine. Grace gave a small smile. "I'm not sure. Maybe a new job. Or maybe I'll stay here a little longer, if you don't mind." Samuel chuckled softly. "I don't mind. But when you decide to move on, I want you to know you'll have my full support." Grace looked at him, feeling a comforting warmth in his words. "Thank you, Samuel. For everything." "And you?" she asked. "What's next for you?" Samuel thought for a moment before answering. "I'm still figuring that out. But for the first time in a long while, I think I can say I'm willing to try." Life at the manor continued, but something had fundamentally changed. Samuel and Grace were no longer defined by what they had lost, but by what they had found, a friendship that transcended judgment, prejudice, and even their own expectations. As Samuel began to rediscover the world with Grace by his side, and as she embraced new opportunities, they both realized that life, no matter how difficult, could still be beautiful. Above all, they came to understand that the second chance they had been searching for wasn't born from circumstances but from the people who crossed their paths. As Samuel and Grace continued to rebuild their lives, learning together the value of friendship, respect, and second chances, they left a message for us all: no one is defined solely by their past. The connections we make, the steps we choose to take, and the courage to face our fears can transform even the most difficult of stories. Now, we'd love to hear from you. Do you believe in second chances? Can you share a moment when someone believed in you, even when you doubted yourself? Share your story in the comments, inspire others, and keep the conversation about transformation and resilience alive. If you enjoyed this story and want to follow more emotional and impactful narratives, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Together, we can spread messages of hope and humanity to the world. For more stories like this, check out our other videos appearing on your screen now.